Thank you. Well, when we were here, many of us last year, five of the world's 10 most valuable companies were American platform businesses. That statistic still holds true today. The difference is the incredible mood change in terms of the public policy response, and that's partly what's happening here in the US, where we have, for example, one of the leading presidential candidates supporting the idea of breaking up Facebook. But it's also what's happening around the rest of the world. And to give you a snapshot, this is really in the last few weeks. Singapore has introduced a law on content liability for tech firms. India's restrictions on e-commerce platforms being vertically integrated with wholesalers has come in, and they've also introduced new data storage rules. Last month, a minister in Canada said self-regulation of tech has failed. And of course, Europe is where probably the most regulatory activity is happening. And again, in the last 10 days, a big report's arrived, commissioned for President Macron, which has suggested regulating tech like banks. Spotify has sued Apple for antitrust violations in Europe. And the list goes on. And our assessment at The Economist is if you go through the regulatory reports of the top 5 tech platforms, there are no less than 33 separate cases or legal investigations going on in Europe over tax, content, and so on. So our job is to grapple with that global picture and try and work out how it fits together, if it does at all. And we have a superb panel which consists of 2 people who've just completed reports for governments in Europe on this very issue, and then 2 people who are leading thinkers from the US on antitrust. And I'd like to start by asking the panelists to introduce themselves. And Alanna, perhaps you could kick off.
Okay, hello, I'm Alanna Rutherford. I'm a lawyer by training, so that will lead me to just be sort of the skeptic naysayer, taking the opposite position at all times from anything else, what anybody else says on the panel. I used to be at a firm called Boies, Schiller & Flexner, and now I work for Visa, which is a platform, but not like any of the platforms we're discussing. And all my views expressed here are simply my own and should not be attributed to or considered a reflection of the views of Visa.
Dennis?
I'm an economics professor here at the University of Chicago. I also served as the Deputy Assistant Attorney General at the Department of Justice. I also participated in a report. I was the only economist on this 12-panel commission that was a congressional commission called the Antitrust Modernization Commission. It was about 10 years ago, and it was asking the question of the antitrust laws up to dealing with problems that are emerging. And I just indicate that that was before Facebook was really as common as it was. So I think the topic of this conference is very timely to revisit some of those issues. And I should also add, I've worked for and against probably every firm we're going to mention.
I hope you were remunerated either way. Yeah, Jacques?
First, Alanna, you know that lots of work on the economics of two-sided markets, which was done in Toulouse, began because of a contract with Visa and was about your platform. So I'm an economist. Actually, Dennis and I were classmates at MIT about 15 years ago, something like this. I teach at the Toulouse School of Economics, and I'm here because I was part of a panel which was set up by Commissioner Vestager to look at the digital economy. 2 points about this panel. Somebody said it was the Vestager report. It wasn't. It was our report, and she was very good about not trying to direct us. And secondly, it's not the Crèmer report. There was no No, I'm the first one in the alphabetic order.
Jason?
I'm Jason Furman. I'm a professor of the practice of economic policy at the Harvard Kennedy School. And the Chancellor of the Exchequer last year asked me if I wanted to come practice economic policy on the United Kingdom. So I led an expert panel for them with the idea that they could try to implement all of it. And if it wasn't terrible, then maybe we could do it here as well.
Well, we're going to start with the two report authors, each talking in turn a little bit about their work. And Jason's going to go first. I should add that Jason succeeded for one day in knocking Brexit off the front page news in Britain after about 3 years of continual coverage. So for that alone, the nation is eternally grateful. Jason,
we were very excited when we made the front page of Competition Daily on March 18th.
And you have 10 minutes.
So, I don't even need any time at all, because I can just tell you that our report is the exact opposite of what Fiona presented to you, in the sense that our chapter on regulation comes before the chapter on antitrust, and not really in any other meaningful sense. I'll go through a few threshold questions that I think any policy in this area has different answers to, and I think animates some of the debates we saw in the first panel. The first panel had a bunch of debate that was effectively about, is competition beneficial? Competition is good at lower prices, higher quantity, more innovation, greater variety, improved quality. If you care about what consumers care about, then competition's probably a good way to get it. If what consumers want is advice on how to carry out genocide or terrorist attacks or child pornography, then competition isn't going to be your solution to those problems. And in fact, competition may exacerbate those problems because it'll get you more quantity, more variety, more of what those consumers want. You don't want what those particular consumers want. I think there's an important role for competition, because I think there's a lot of things that are in the efficient space. There are a lot of things where what consumers care about do matter. I think privacy is one particular one, in addition to all the features of products and the like. But if we have more competition, we're probably going to have more of some of that bad stuff. And so you need more non-competitive regulation as well around online harms and the like. So I don't think this is a substitute for them or a solution to these other problems. In fact, it might require you to do more in those other areas if you're doing more on competition. Overall, though, I think there's a lot of important ways in which competition is beneficial. The second is competition absent? We heard an awful lot about the dynamics of market tipping. Winners take most. We don't need to go over that right now. The important question is whether there's competition for the market. The MySpace, Lycos, and Alta Vista arguments for competition for the market get weaker by the year since we saw those products. All of them were very brief. We're now much more persistent, much more scale, much more personalized data, much more acquisitions that help entrench that power. So I wouldn't bet on competition for the market being successful in the current policy regime. Examples from 20 years ago, if anything, to me, prove the opposite. So my answer to this competition absent is yes, not just at a point in time, but competition for the market. The last is, can we have competition? One view is that these are natural monopolies, that you need the scope that they have, and that we might as well just regulate based on that assumption. Another view is that part of why you have these is partly for good reasons of the economies of scope, but partly because of choices about technical standards, about data, choices by regulators about what mergers and acquisitions to allow, about what conduct to allow, and that if you make different choices on all of those, then a greater degree of competition would be possible. And so, our report basically answers yes to all three of those. It's not an unqualified yes. I think there's important elements of no in all of those, but end up in what can we do to foster entry, to foster competition. And we spent a lot of time on mergers and antitrust and all those sorts of things, and came away with the same conclusion Fiona had, that it was decades, it was relatively small. And so we almost reluctantly came to the conclusion that we needed more of an ex-ante approach. We call it a digital markets unit. We were agnostic about where it would be. In the United States, this could be the FTC. It doesn't need to be a new body. We could argue about that. In the UK, it could be the CMA. It could be a new body. It could be something else. What's more important is the functions. And the first function we talked about is a code of conduct. This would apply to entities that had significant market status. That would be a designation process that you would go through. It would last 3 to 5 years. It would be renewed periodically. And once you were under it, you would have to be transparent in terms of access to your platform, not excluding people from other platforms, not prioritizing your own search results, properties, sharing data within your properties in a way that others couldn't, and the like. That code of conduct is not grounded in a notion of human rights, it's grounded in a notion of competition. But instead of doing it ex post through fines, and I think Fiona talked well about some of the limitations of that, you do it ex ante. You could be more detailed about what was expected, more prescriptive, give companies more of a roadmap of what they can do and what they can't do. And importantly, you could be flexible over time. We talked about some of the limitations of a behavioral remedy in an antitrust authority, which just doesn't have the ongoing monitoring capability. So I think with the code of conduct, the question isn't whether we're going to do this enforcement, it's when we're going to do it, who's going to do it, are we going to wait for the decades-long lawsuits, or are we going to try to do more of it in advance? Second is data mobility and open standards. Here, the example of open banking in the UK is instructive. You have, I think it was 8 or 9 large financial institutions that essentially didn't have an incentive to make their platforms accessible for other companies to build products on top of, because it would cannibalize their own profits and their own ability to do inferior versions of those products. So the CMA told them they had to. Version 1 of they had to meant they did 18 different screens between the consumer, the new fintech company, and their product. Version 2 set up a dedicated body with substantial funding that could be actually in there in the trenches day in and day out trying to figure out how you could make this work. The reason this is important is often we say there's some, it's great that everyone's on the same Facebook. Wouldn't it be terrible to have 6 different ones? We could have had a world where email was invented by one company, and we'd be saying exactly the same thing. Email's a natural monopoly. It makes sense for there only to be one email company. Would you want a world where your email couldn't email to somebody else's email? We don't have that conversation about email because we have open standards. There's a lot of work that Facebook, Google, and others have done on open standards, but they don't have a full set of incentives to do that work, which is why a body needs to. And then finally, data openness, which again isn't a self-executing, you pass a law and say data is open. It's very much a use case by use case in the trenches. Do you want to take geospatial data for autonomous vehicles and make that open? Do you want to synonymize this data? Do you want to have that in a data trust that is accessible? There's every one of those cases is complicated, difficult, and you need somebody to help figure it out. There's definitely a role for competition policy on mergers. We heard about the 600 acquisitions by the platforms. There were definitely no errors of blocking any merger that should have been allowed because there were no mergers that were blocked. I think there almost certainly were false negatives. Do I know, would it be 5 mergers we would have blocked? 500? I think it would be closer to 5 than to 500. But something like Facebook, Instagram was sort of, tech press at the time knew that Facebook was trying to extinguish a potential competitor. VCs knew, you could see it in the price, and yet there wasn't really a mechanism to have that conversation about potential competition, about innovation. And so steps like updating merger assessment guidelines or the horizontal merger guidelines in the United States, prioritizing the scrutiny of digital mergers. We had a specific idea that shifted more to a cost-benefit analysis. So 10% chance you get rid of competition. Getting rid of competition would be really bad. You get to block that. We rejected a presumption switch for the digital platforms. I think for the UK to do that all on its own would be a problem. It means you'd get some startups leaving the country. For the United States, I think it's a more viable option. On antitrust, it's very sort of weedsy in UK, and I'll skip over it, in part because I couldn't even repeat all of it to you. A lot of stuff related to the legal process, what evidence you can enter when, who gets independent authority, and they have a sector-specific tribunal that basically only makes errors in one direction. And then finally, some other things we talked about is online advertising. We talked about that a lot this morning. That area requires special scrutiny. And we didn't talk at all, I don't think, about monitoring algorithmic collusion and personalized pricing. But we can come back to all of that. I do think there's a lot of commonalities with the report there, with what Jacques will talk about, and wanted to end by saying that often uncertainty is used as an argument in technology for not doing anything. I think it's precisely the opposite. I think when you don't do something, you have irreversible changes. And when you're trying to make decisions under uncertainty with irreversibility, not doing anything can be an extremely costly thing. If you allow a merger, for example, it's really hard to unallow that merger. If you don't allow a merger, you can change your mind 3 or 4 years later and allow it if you've learned more. So it's much easier, I think, to move one way than the other, and trying to move forward, I think, is really important for all of us. Thank you.
And just a very quick question, Jason, you presumably interacted a bit with the tech firms on this. What's their view of this schema? Do they think it's pie in the sky, impractical, great news? Did you get a sense of their response?
Well, I think Hal is here somewhere, so he can speak for one of the minor companies. I think a lot of companies know something needs to happen, and they'd like what happens to be better, not worse, and are looking for models. So I think I have heard less, outright hostility, frankly, than I expected.
Okay.
But maybe that means we messed up and we're captured, Luigi.
Jacques?
Yeah, by the way, I nearly left this morning because, we've all been complaining about targeting advertising. And I found on my welcome screen this morning an advertisement for an MBA at Booth. So, but the data is not very good. I already have an MBA. So, I'm going to say a few things about our report, but rather than summarizing it, I'd like to put it in a broader perspective. And I'm going to retake some of the themes which were discussed earlier this morning. And this is going to be my first ever European chauvinistic talk with Professor Monti here. This is a good time to do this. And Jason, I'm sorry, I'm going to enroll you as an honorary European. Okay. Your political career is dead in the US. You'll never be elected. You'll never be confirmed by the Senate. But that's, no, basically, when I discussed with my American friends, and I'm happy to see that this is changing, you have the impression that the US debate is stuck between a business as usual position. We don't change anything. And the neo-Brandesian approach, of people like Lina Khan, Elizabeth Warren, Timu, and so on. And I think that both of those approaches will not work. And I think that the approach that Europe is trying to take, it's not very successful, I agree, is actually the right approach. And that's what I'd like to argue. So if you look at both our reports, they begin by trying to show, and I think it's convincing, that the functioning of competition is fundamentally altered by the characteristics of a digital economy. Jason's report does that in a more factual way. We do that in a more theoretical way. But Hal and Carl did that 20-odd years ago in competition rules also. Okay? And Fiona did a very good job at saying very strong returns to scale, network externalities, the presence of data, the role of data, and so on. Now, what I really want to stress is that this means that we've lost the competitive benchmark. Okay? We had a theory of competitive markets. And the role of competition policy was to say, well, we know what the competition would look like, and there would be small firms and so on, and we've got a hammer, which is competition policy, to repair the economy when it's not working. We really don't know how unfettered competition, we know that unfettered competition will not work in this market, and I think we've got to be careful. There's this tendency of saying, oh, they are very big firms, and tendency of saying, oh, they must have done something anti-competitive. Okay? I think even if they've all been run by saints, we would have a few very big firms. It's not a question of bad behavior. It's a question of the technology and the economics of it. And we have a real problem trying to decide under those conditions, how do we adapt our tools? And I think so for instance, the meaning of prices is totally altered in this environment. Okay? And I think it's very, very important to recognize that we understand this environment much less than the rest of the economy. We were discussing the role of academia in this, and I think we have to be, no, it doesn't mean that we've got to be modest in our propositions, but we've got to be modest in how, when we discuss, and to recognize the uncertainty which we face. So we argue, I think, in both reports that these changes make an adjustment in competition policy unavoidable. And I think in both reports, we say that it's going to be towards tougher enforcement. And I think this is, in any case, this is going to be done because the social and political role of the platforms is so big that it's perfectly normal that there is strong public scrutiny. Our report, contrary to the CMA report, doesn't discuss the redesign of institutions. We are not asked to do this, so we really concentrated on how we should change competition policy. I do believe that there are interesting issues about how we redesign regulation, competition policy, and also consumer protection law and the interfaces, but we didn't discuss this. So let me give you two examples of type of proposals which we make to kind of turn up the temperature, the dial. So first we speak about a number of cases in which the burden of proof in competition policy should be changed. Take the example of multi-homing between platforms. Okay? It's a fun game for theoreticians to make model in which multi-homing is good for competition and examples in which multi-homing is bad for competition. Right now, according to current practice, a competition authority, if it sees a practice, would have to A, prove that it discourages multi-homing, because it's usually not, I'm forbidding multi-homing, but also prove that in that specific case, it lowers consumer welfare. Okay? We believe that even though it's possible to find theoretical arguments in which multi-homing would be pro-competitive, in general, multi-homing would be anti-competitive. In general, it's going to be pro-competitive, and that the task of a competition authority would be to show that the practice is indeed prevents multi-homing, but then pass the burden on to the platform, a dominant platform, to explain why it thinks that in this case it's something which it should be allowed to do. Okay, and we can think of methods by which we can give it a little bit more legal security when it wants to attempt to do this. Second example of change of perspective, recent economic literature on platform has gone far away from the focus on prices, which existed at the beginning, to look at the way the platforms are managing the interactions between the agents which are using the platform. In some sense, the platforms are regulators. They regulate part of our economy. What we propose is that there should be a rule that the large platforms should have a responsibility to make sure that the way in which they regulate their mini economy is competitive. Okay, there is no reason why we should have competition law for the rest of the economy, and that the platform should be entitled to sell monopoly rights. Okay, and I'd be happy to provide examples where I think things like this are happening, which are not right. So the way we put it is the operators of dominant platforms have a responsibility to ensure that competition on their platforms is fair, unbiased, and pro-users. So there's lots more in the report. The list is not. What we have is, I didn't participate too much on this, so I can say how much I think it's great. There's really a good discussion on data, in particular the fact that we are a multidisciplinary group with a legal scholar and a data scientist really help. Contrary to the CMA report, we have a little bit more discussion about non-consumer data, production data, and so on. How much more time do I have?
For a couple of minutes.
Okay. So my reading of the US debate is that it's stuck between, how do I change it? Between two positions. Okay, one position which is do not change the law. And this is represented by the courthouse here. And basically, there are one or two things. First, some people, and you hear this, argue things are going well. There are lots of innovation. People are using platforms in large numbers, which prove that that's what they're supposed to do. The second reason for not changing the law is, well, judges won't let us do it. We are stuck in a case law which has developed in a way which we can't handle. Too bad. Okay. The second position. And the picture here is, by the way, the idea of using this picture is stolen from Christina's wonderful presentation in Bologna last year, okay? Is that we should really have a radical new intervention, and we heard this morning, often by breaking up the dominant platforms, okay? I think both of those positions are wrong, okay? The first one is wrong because the world has changed. We need to do something about it. The second one is because nobody's explaining to me first, how would you break up Google? I mean, would it be that the search engine, if your search begins from A to M, you have to go to Google 1, and from N to Z to Google 2? And nobody is explaining to me what would happen afterwards, as Fiona pointed out earlier. Okay, so I think what Europe is trying to do right now is finding, you see, this is my chauvinistic view, okay? We're coming to the European elections. Europe is trying to find a middle ground. And if it is implemented, given the global nature of the big platforms, this will have influence all over the world. I mean, we shouldn't specialize in the antitrust of our country because it doesn't really matter whether it's the US or Europe which acts. In any case, it comes to the same thing. Okay, and it's really important for us in Europe that we have US involvement in this, in particular because there's a huge amount of intellectual firepower on this side of the Atlantic, which we could use. 3 quick points before finishing. This is not an anti-large platform position. I think that a lot of what we try to do in our report is say that there should be a clarification of the rule, and we repeatedly call for more guidance. And I think this is really something which is very important. Second thing, I really don't want to say that Europe has all the solutions. So I wouldn't want to say, oh, Europe has done things. Its enforcement does have difficulties. I think it's just asking the better questions right now. And finally, third kind of thing I want to say is that there's a real tendency in Europe to blame the real or imaginary anti-competitive behavior of large platforms for the lack of innovative activity in Europe. I live in Europe. I can tell you this is not the main cause. Okay, come and teach in a French university. You'll know what I'm speaking about. Okay, but I still believe that we are on the right path in the way in which we're asking those questions. And thank you very much.
Okay. Jacques, a very quick question. Commissioner Vestager, who has been behind a big push in sort of European competition activity, is probably not going to be doing that job for much longer. Is your sense that that makes any difference if there's a personnel change at the top?
Yes. No, yeah, clearly the personality of the commissioners is very important, and but we've got better experts here than I am about the functioning of the commission. But yes, it's
So could this be a sort of cyclical high in European competition policy, do you think?
Yes, I think there's lots of pressure. There's lots of political pressure to do something. Okay, the problem is how. So I don't think that Europe competition law is going to come to doing nothing. I mean, that's not going to happen. The problem is whether or not it does intelligent things. Okay, I think that's the real issue, and that clearly depends on the next commissioner, but it also depends on the rest of the commission and on the interactions between the commissioners, and that's a very complicated game which I don't really understand very well.
Okay. Alanna, you're I think it's fair to say, a bit skeptical about the European approach. Tell us what you think.
Thank you for that. I would say my comments would go twofold. One is I'm skeptical about expanding powers in competition law areas in Europe, and then also just sort of a caution to all of you who are writing papers in the antitrust realm. I think we are at a point in history where we're asking ourselves big questions, but maybe we're asking them in too theoretical a way. And as someone who has done antitrust litigation for 18 years, I think we have to think about the practical effects on business and how this plays out in the real world. And I'm concerned that reports and papers will be used as, Monsieur Crèmer said, a hammer, using antitrust as a hammer to do something that would require scalpel and perhaps would be more effectively done through regulatory policy, privacy law, whatever it is, to achieve the same goal. Just to delve more deeply into those 2 points, actually, take a step back. So one of my very junior colleagues was gave a little talk on antitrust to several of his colleagues in the intellectual property realm. And he started off by saying, competition law is designed to promote capitalism in a way that it doesn't interfere with the social contract. So it's always been a pro-competitive tool. It's always been a pro-capitalist tool. And it just goes to show you that democracy and capitalism go hand in hand. And somehow in our discussions, when we're talking about antitrust these days, we use competition law or talks about competition law to sort of rewrite social policy, which is not really what it was meant to achieve. And my concern when you say, well, you can create a new regulatory body or you can do it through the existing, every time you create a new commission, a new agency, a new scope, what happens is they now have to justify their existence. So you get a sort of exercises of power that don't necessarily lead to good results. It inhibits business, and it creates what I think is bad policy. You get sort of like the recent German decision on antitrust against Google. But so the question is, how do you do it? I'm worried that some of the things we talk about, and Mr. Crèmer kind of said the same thing. Large platforms are not bad, and you get that naturally. And there are industries where there's natural monopolies, oligopolies, et cetera. However, ensuring that they do this in a fair way, ensuring that it doesn't inhibit competition generally or hurt consumers requires a review of more than just antitrust law. You have to take a bigger look at what policy, how overall laws and policies are working together. I disagree slightly that relying upon current laws would somehow mean you can't regulate or efficiently accomplish the goals that we're talking about. I think yesterday we had Apple v. Pepper that clarified what is a direct purchaser and whether consumers could bring causes of actions against platforms. That is using existing law and clarifying existing law. I actually don't think it's a change in law at all. It's using existing law to just say, yes, we can have ways to address platforms' behavior through direct class actions against platforms. I think that there was, I had another example in mind. I think, when you look at Chris Hughes' editorial, for example, against Facebook, that wasn't about, it was about a lot of things, but I don't think it was really about antitrust at all. And I think there are ways to sort of implement the ideas that are suggested in it and what's going on there without using antitrust as a tool. I'm not saying that there are no antitrust issues in the digital platform arena. What I'm saying is that when we're talking about rewriting the laws and when we're talking about the need to protect the social contract and consumers, it is not the only tool or even the best tool in many cases to regulate digital platforms, and we have to start thinking. I understand that this room is largely economists and antitrust thinkers, but we have to start thinking more broadly. I would also say, just to talk a little bit about the interplay, we don't talk enough about, and we don't look at how each of the laws that are promulgated affect one another. Like, for example, GDPR, which I think is a good law that needs to be in place that protects consumer privacy, but it also means that you're probably not going to have, and I'm not the only one who's talking about this, new products that involve consumer information launch in Europe first, or even at the same time as they launch in other locations, simply because it requires a financial investment to implement the regulatory structure of GDPR. And I see people shaking their heads, but these are the things that we need to think about and talk about. And there are existing ways to do things, and there's a lot of cross-pollination in policy. And if we don't think about the financial effects of increasing regulation, we're not going to get the results that we think we can achieve. I don't ultimately think it's good to. And by the way, I should just say, my personal belief is I believe in a highly competitive digital platform space. I believe that some of these mergers were not good things to let through, but we are where we are. But at the same time, I don't believe that just using antitrust to get another 50 million or 100 million out of a company is going to solve the problems that we face. And the fact that
we don't do that in million in Europe. We do that in billion.
Sadly, I'm well aware of that from where I currently sit.
I suspect that proves her argument, not rebuts it. But okay, cool.
But that's it.
Thank you, Dennis. First of all, as someone who comes from steeped in a kind of antitrust background, do you think there is something different about digital markets? And secondly, how do you think the intellectual climate is changing here in the US? I mean, the sort of caricature from Europe would be that America's behind on this, and I wondered if you thought that was right.
Okay, well, let me try and deal with each question. First, a lot of the characteristics of the digital economy also characterize other industries. People were talking about newspapers earlier. So these characteristics aren't new, and I think economists are trained to think them through. But the fact is that the collection of characteristics in the digital economy are such that it makes either regulation or antitrust competition policy really challenging to implement. Doesn't mean you shouldn't do anything, but it just means these are hard problems, and simple solutions be very wary of. Breaking up the companies sounds simple, not going to work out, I don't think. Appointing a regulator without well-defined and thought through responsibilities. That too won't work. So I think you just got to be careful. The characteristics that I think are most important, they were outlined earlier by Fiona. I'll just quickly go through them. Rapid technological change means it's hard either for antitrust or regulation. Huge scale economies. After perhaps an initial competitive battle, market tips because of network externalities and scale economies. So therefore, you have durable market power for years and years. We know there are multiple products that are delivered, economies of scope. All of those, I think, are a bundle of products that make either regulation or antitrust hard to figure out. I think there's a recognition, growing recognition, maybe early on there wasn't as much, that data is key to understanding how these markets operate. And finally, these are huge in their effects, these markets. So that means the stakes are pretty high to get it right. And it's wrong to think that anything is going to be self-correcting, I think. So let me now turn to sort of thinking in antitrust. I can't tell you about what others think in antitrust. I can't tell you what I think, and there are a lot of thinkers in antitrust in this room, so I'm sure they'll correct me when they disagree with me. But I want to distinguish first between antitrust and regulation. Matt, in the earlier panel, talked about a lot of problems. Fake news, privacy, democracy. Antitrust is not well equipped to deal with many of these problems. So I'm going to focus on antitrust and competition. Now, I thought Doug gave an answer earlier that really explains how I, anyway, think about antitrust. It's to preserve the process of competition. Now, it's only worthwhile to preserve the process of competition if you think the industry is going to have competition. If you think things are a natural monopoly, antitrust is not the right thing to be using. But I believe, as I think the reports, all of them, indicate, that there is an important role for preserving and maintaining the process of competition. So I want to focus, in my thinking, on what is it that dominant firms do that harm rivals. And that's what I want to prevent. So let me just give you a few examples. There's been a lot of literature. I have some articles with Ralph Winter on this, on what we call vertical most favored nations clauses, sometimes called price parity clauses. And let me just give you an example. And Alanna, you won't like this example, but it involves credit cards. So I go in, I'll use an American Express card to a merchant, and I buy something, the merchant has to pay American Express some money. So let's suppose someone has a good idea to come up with a new credit card, goes to the merchant, says, I can sign up lots of customers, won't charge you a penny. And the merchant says, well, how am I going to induce people to use your card? And I said, well, you should charge surcharge the American Express card when they come in. The merchant says, that's a great idea. You must have gotten an MBA, but you never used the credit card. You don't know anything about business. I have a contractual restriction that prevents me from doing that. Wow. That makes it very hard for this new credit card company to enter and entice and get business. You have similar things on hotel booking sites. Now, Europe is ahead of us on this than in the United States, but there are price parity clauses that say, you want to use my platform to book a hotel, Mr. Hotel? Well, you tell me that you're not going to sell on another platform or even at your own hotel at a lower price. So that makes it very hard for a new platform to form that says, I'm better than that old platform. And Mr. Hotel, please use me more and surcharge people who are using the hotel booking site that's charging you a higher price. All of those deter entry. Now, I'm not saying there can't be justifications, and I'm sure you might come up, if you were American Express, you would, in my example, have justifications. But what Ariel said on one of the earlier panels is right. Just because you can think of a possible justification doesn't mean that it is a justification that balances the harms. The flip side is also true. Just because I can write a paper with a theoretical model that shows there could be a harm doesn't mean there's a harm. But I think we've got to be very careful and in the balancing here and pay much more attention to harming rivals, given the tipping nature of these markets. Second, data, I said, is really important. I think there's a clear understanding of that. Maybe we should regard data as an asset, so when firms merge, even if they're doing different things with their data set, you want to ask, is the combination of those two data sets somehow creating undue concentration? All I can say, there have been a lot of discussions about undoing mergers, and had we not allowed this merger, that company would have grown. How do you know that? These ideas about potential competition, they're easy to say, and in retrospect, maybe it's easy to see who succeeded. But they're really hard. When you're at the Justice Department, you have to make a prediction as to who's going to succeed. You look at the track record of people who have made such predictions. It's not so good. So that's really hard to do. However, regarding data, what I would say is pay special attention to preserve the process of competition. If someone says, I don't want, you can use my platform, and people can sell on the platform, but I don't want you to give information to my rival about who's using your store. Whoa, that's a restriction on data. I want to be much more cognizant of those and pay much more attention to those in this economy. You should pay attention to standards. Maybe standards will work, maybe they won't. They have their own problems. Third, in these platforms, as platform markets, as we've seen, there are multiple products. When you have multiple products, my prediction is you're going to see a lot of antitrust suits, you've seen some already, involving Tiein Sales. Okay? Now, in the United States anyway, our doctrines on Tiein Sale are pretty bad. Jefferson Parish is the precedent. I'll leave it to the lawyers to describe the failings of that. But I just want to make a distinction about harms that come from Tiein Sales. And there's a little difference between the United States and Europe. When you have a Tiein sale, there are two ways it can operate, or at least two ways. First way is it can act just as a mechanism of price discrimination. It charges more intensive users a higher price than less intensive users. That's the old story of selling a salt machine and tying the salt. So I'll give you the machine for free, but you overpay for salt. That has nothing necessarily to do with competition. On the other hand, and Doug gave the example of the Microsoft case, there were allegations of tying in which, as a result of the tying, by harming a rival producing that complementary product perhaps could have developed into a competitor to the company doing the tying. That is a harm to competition. So if we're using the antitrust laws, we have to refine how we use Tiein Sales and think about it more carefully. I mentioned the price parity clause. What I forgot to mention is that the Supreme Court, in my view, really blew it in the American Express decision. And I don't know what to say if you think the Supreme Court is making economic errors other than,
we're going to get onto the Supreme Court in it.
Okay, then I think an economist says it's not the antitrust laws, it's what the Supreme Court is interpreting to do. I'll just end with two final things that I kind of heard from these presentations. One, there was a suggestion of specialized courts. Let me just tell you, you've got to be careful with specialized courts. And what Alanna said, specialized courts as well as specialized regulatory agencies create their own political influence and can create their own problems. There is a specialized court that was created for patent courts. That's widely thought to have not worked out too well. It's also the case, and I don't know if Randy's still in the audience, I have my reading glasses on, but he can tell us maybe in the question and answer period, there was a specialized antitrust court for certain matters in the early 1900s, and it was abolished because they thought it didn't work well. Finally, if you think antitrust isn't working, and we are regulating, it's not an either-or decision. I think all of the reports recognize this. We really should use them in a complementary way. What regulations, given we're regulating, can improve the process of competition? The only thing I would say, based on some experience I've had the FCC, dealing with the FCC and the Justice Department simultaneously is when you design, it's like a mechanism design problem. When you design two agencies to be dealing with the same industry, you create serious problems unless you have assured yourself that the areas of overlapping responsibility won't be so great, so you get two agencies, so you can avoid getting two agencies in a fight. So bottom line, I think the process of competition can be improved. Does that solve all the problems? No.
Okay, so what we've had there is almost a perfect illustration of the transatlantic divide, I think, where we have the kind of holistic, probably more economics-driven view, and then a more kind of doctrine and sort of legal-based sense of what to do with the problem. Now, having said that, I do think there are some areas of common ground, and we're going to try and skip through these at high speed before we go to Q&A. And the one I thought we should perhaps particularly focus on is the idea that platforms do have some kind of special responsibility to their customers in terms of their conduct. And it's interesting listening to the various reports. There are various bits of terminology that have been created to deal with this. So, for example, platforms have strategic market status, bottleneck status, they're unavoidable trading partners, they have rule-setting powers, they have most favored trading powers. So there seems to be, from all of the different backgrounds, some sort of vague common ground there. So I'd like to touch on that. And perhaps, Jason, can you start? What are the responsibilities? I mean, are they different? And the idea that they have a sort of obligation to preserve competition on their platform, do you think that makes sense?
We usually use the word gateway, which you didn't have.
Gateway, sorry.
You can use the word bottleneck and the like. Yeah, I mean, these are as, the entryway into a lot of different things that you need to do and have no choice but to enter through them. And if you want to sell something, you need to be on one of these platforms. If you want your search results available, if you want to connect through a social network and the like, and they're very dominant. And that's why some sort of code of conduct of how you use that dominance when you're a gateway, a bottleneck, or whatever your word is really important. I just wouldn't count on goodwill to get us there. It could be fear of multi-billion-dollar fines that get us there. But I think the companies are right when they say they're not entirely sure sort of what they were fined for. And Tim was definitely right when he says they didn't quite follow through and figure out how to make it work going forward in terms of the remedies. So I don't think a disincentive is enough to get the behavior you want when you're not entirely sure what it is you're disincentivizing with those fines. I think you need to be clearer about what that code of conduct is and have it be enforceable. And there's a lot of different ways to do that. Some of them under the law right now that wouldn't require any new laws here in the United States.
So if I speak to Alexa, my smart speaker, and I say, Alexa, can you suggest 2 holidays I should go on? Should they be obliged to give me a totally neutral set of recommendations?
I think Amazon should have a very different responsibility in that regard. If you want to make your own product and you're some pipsqueak company and you want to tie your own things in with it, that's perfectly great. These are, companies have a real strategic status and should have a different set of rules in that regard.
And you would apply that across different product sets. So if I do Siri and say, Siri, can you suggest 3 movies? It would need to be one that's not connected with Apple in any way. Again, the advice... Not
connected, just done in not favoring your own products. Yeah, okay. I think that's an important part.
Because that mirrors, in a sense, your idea that they have an obligation to preserve competition within the perimeter of their platform.
Yes, so I think a good example would be, because Dennis mentioned it, hotel platforms. I mean, if you go either on Expedia, if you're American, or Booking, if you are European, you get a listing of things. Now, if you try to figure out the default listing is dependent on the payments made by the hotels to the platform in a way which is totally opaque. You need to go and click very far down at the bottom to tell you, we take this into account. And for some reason, they also take your booking. I don't know if about Expedia also takes into account whether you pay your bills, whether the hotel pays its bills to booking on time. And I think, here we spend lots of resources, competition policy and so on, making sure that the hotel market is competitive. There is no reason why we should accept that platform distorts it.
So Dennis, you're I think touching on actually a similar set of themes using a different language, which is most favored status and the sort of power of the platform to control the behavior of people interacting on it. Do you think there is any overlap between that set of visions that essentially the platform has a sort of basic requirement to enforce free competition and your world and concepts? I mean, are those?
Well, I think they're related, but they're different.
Yeah.
So my examples of the no surcharge rule or the booking sites deterred entry and harmed competition. So that was in the credit card case, harmed another credit card company from coming in. That's horizontal competition. In these cases in which, I'm a platform, should I have a responsibility or a duty to deal with anyone who wants to come on? That's a different question. And there are lawyers in the room, they can correct me if I'm wrong, but under US antitrust law, you don't have a duty to deal. There is no essential facility doctrine that the Supreme Court has articulated in the United States. That's different than for example, in
the Alexa example, if I ask Alexa to suggest products or holidays or whatever it happens to be, are they under any obligation to give me a neutral search result?
Well, I'll defer to the lawyers on the answer
but I think
to
the
that.
question is what ought to be,
But there was an exact problem like that many years ago with computer reservation systems. And the CAB regulated that you couldn't have biased systems for exactly the reason Jason is saying. And you needed regulation.
Would that fall within your concept of the process of competition being?
So that's a little trickier. What I described interferes with the process of competition. Let's ask the question, let's suppose I'm on a site and I own the platform and I also sell candy bars, and you sell candy bars. Can I favor myself? Now, putting aside a duty, you should ask my economic...
If I may say so, you're sounding surprisingly European, which is forget what happens in reality, let's discuss what happens in theory. Take the two examples. You're asking a smart assistant to be your conduit to the world of commerce.
I think it depends.
Do they have an obligation?
I think the answer is it depends on what you think the economic consequences are of the restriction. And it depends on what happens if, are you allowed to charge for someone to come on your platform? So the distinction, it's very similar to Tiein Sales. If you're selling a candy bar or whatever it is you want to postulate you're selling, unless you work through the economic implications of what happens if I say, don't buy his, buy mine, you can't answer intelligently the question, should I have a duty? That was the point of my example, not to make, the only reason I was using a candy bar is simple to think through. Now the question is that harming the process of competition? So in the Microsoft case, the argument was, if I don't let you, have a browser or whatever, that preserved Microsoft's market power in operating systems. All I'm saying is that's a logical antitrust argument. The argument that I'm trying to make people buy my candy bar rather than yours, why should I do that? Can't I charge you for the right to be on my system and therefore make more money? So this popular conception that, say, Amazon or whoever doesn't want a competitor on their system, that's not right because they want to sell a lot of product. Now it's true, they might want to sell their own product, but they don't want to prevent consumers from getting what they want because they could maximize, not out of goodwill, but it would be profitable for them to do so. So all I'm saying is that you've got to figure out the profitable incentives. That's a different question than asking, should they have a responsibility, which is, I think, what Jason was saying, maybe it'd be easier just to say, if you're a market and you're holding yourself out to be a market, these are some things you got to do. So make the analogy to, no one's talked at all about securities markets. But securities markets are platform. Take a futures exchange. It's a platform. And we do have regulations, but we do allow various types of competition. And the rules of those platforms are designed based on what people think the outcome should be. They're not just by antitrust.
We're going to, in the interest of time, skip. So question is there some sort of obligation? Would it be good if there was an obligation? And secondly, does that somehow fit into, in any sense, an American concept of antitrust law?
I would be reluctant to put a duty to deal into antitrust law. You might want to regulate or change legislation, but a duty to deal, I think, would go against Trinco.
Okay.
I think we're overcomplicating things. We say digital, and all of a sudden everyone loses their minds and can't figure out what the problem is. The example that they just gave, Amazon selling things, that's called a grocery store. You've got your in-house product that you sell that is, you know, I don't know, Kroger brand, and you have the Snickers bar, you have the Milky Way, you have whatever other competitive bars. You sell them all in the same supermarket. And guess what? When you ask, you know, Alexa or wherever to buy you a candy bar, that's fine. Where does it get complicated? Very simple. We know what the answer is for that. Where does it get complicated? When you talk about things like, you know, instantaneous dynamic pricing, now that I know that you like Snickers, I'm going to automatically rearrange the pricing every time Alanna clicks on to Amazon so that my bar is 50 cents cheaper than any other bar out there. And those are the types of things that you have to look out for. But the basic concepts of antitrust still work there, and you can still figure out what the problem is. And so I think we also have to distinguish between platforms. We talk about the FANGs. Netflix is not the same as Amazon. And we have to stop, you know, putting everything together and thinking it's the same problem. But there is an answer to all these questions, and we've answered them in the past, and we can answer them in the future. And sorry, 5 more seconds. Yep. One of the things that we need to also consider is that we're about, and I think in Jason's report he mentions it, the life cycle of where we are in the platform development and creation is still very new. We don't know how it's going to turn out, and usually it's around this time, the 10 to 15 year mark, that you see substantial changes, even without regulatory policy. So I would just caution about, you know, using large cuts versus small incremental changes to foster the type of competitive markets that you want.
Okay, I think we're going to move on to questions, and if you could keep them reasonably brief, and we'll try and whiz through as many as possible. Could we start with the gentleman in the back row in the center, please?
Hi, thanks. There are 1.2 billion Catholics in the world. They have a belief system, they have a ritual, and the things they do. There are 1.7 billion Facebook users in the world, and growing. So my argument is that the current competition law doesn't really cater for the existing digital environment. We have a new government, essentially, and the existing competition law exists for state and federal bound firms. This new pope, Zuckerberg, is basically a pope, and Bezos is like the secretary of the Department of Transportation, is competing on that front. I mean, the digital media is very efficient at anything you put your mind to. They can get you the coffee you want. They can get you the suit you want. They know where you stay. And we are like, basically we are like, it's like a religion. So my question is, can we begin to see the digital media as more than, the digital platforms as more than just a firm, but a system of, a new system basically, a new reality, a new government?
So are they a sovereign state? Let's take a couple more questions, and then we should speed up the process. Carl, do you want to?
Hoping to hear a little more from the panel about equal access or non-discrimination issues. You've talked about it here. It seems to me there's a couple divides. One is, can antitrust deal with the problem? You know, if whether it's Amazon or Facebook or Google doesn't treat, they're integrated into other things and they have competitors, and maybe they're the entrants that Fiona emphasized. If it doesn't treat them equally and blocks that, is antitrust capable of dealing with that? That's one thing, and it may differ from the U.S. versus the EU, because Dennis has mentioned Trinco. If there's no duty to deal or whatever, maybe the U.S. is, maybe this is an area where the U.S. is really could strengthen our doctrine and learn something from the Europeans. Do we think that's going on? Or alternatively, is this just hopeless for antitrust, this equal treatment, and that's what the digital authority should be doing? Because it seems to me a lot of the issues we're talking about, and we'll keep talking about for the next couple of years, will come back to or revolve around this equal access non-discrimination issue for the platforms.
Okay, and let's do one more question. Gentleman there.
Mine is a somewhat specific sort of retrospective look for Jason, because you were with the Obama administration. Do you think that the decision by the Obama FTC to close the Google investigation in 2013 has aged well? And looking back, do you feel like there was undue political pressure in that process, inappropriate political pressure?
Okay, that is a rather good question, isn't it? Okay, let's go through these quickly. So first of all, Jacques, why don't you handle the first one? Does the analogy with a sort of country or a sovereign state that is somehow above the law, does it make sense?
No. I mean, no, it doesn't.
And yet your report argues that they have special obligations
yeah,
to act as a regulator, right?
You have special obligation as a journalist, to tell the truth and so on. It doesn't mean you are a sovereign state. I mean, no. They don't have legitimacy that elected government or non-elected government has.
Okay, so they have some of some extra responsibilities, but the full analogy doesn't.
I don't know, if you run a school, you are not a sovereign state, and you've got the responsibility not to torture the children. That doesn't mean you are a sovereign state.
Okay, next one. Okay, so entry. Does U.S. antitrust, is it capable of dealing with that problem? Carl's question.
I actually was thinking about this after it was asked, and I think the answer is yes and no. Typical lawyer answer. There are definitely tools that allow regulators to require equal access. However, it really depends on the circumstances and what's going on. Are we talking about Google under investigation for bad behavior, or are we talking about some new platform that's being created? There's not. You can't just impose competitive regulation on entities that lack either market power or have exhibited any sort of anti-competitive behavior. And so that's why I say you have to look to regulatory rules and also open standards.
So that would be our digital regulators' problem, potentially, not the antitrust people.
Although my argument is don't create a separate regulator, because you're just going to get yourself in trouble.
So your basic point is do nothing.
No. My basic point is you have lots of regulatory entities out there. You create another one. You're asking it to justify its existence, which means that it doesn't just regulate the things it needs to regulate. But it starts regulating everything, and as an exercise of justifying its own existence and power.
So the concern about capture.
I would be specific about examples, but everyone in this room is a participant in one of them.
Dennis, just quickly, so Carl's question on entry, is there a flaw in U.S. antitrust law, or can it deal adequately with the...
My sense is that if you want to have non-discrimination provisions, that tends to be more regulatory, I think, than something the antitrust laws can deal with, given Trinco. But I also think that sort of an earlier point that the value of networks and interoperability in networks that sometimes the FCC mandates has proven to be very valuable for, say, cell phones. You know, I can call you if I have an AT&T phone and you have a Verizon phone. It sounds like it would be a nightmare if we had to all be carrying.
But that's an FTC problem, not an antitrust.
FCC.
FCC problem,
yes,
sorry.
so that's why I think the answer,
Yep.
as I think about it to Carl's question, is it sounds more regulatory unless, you know, there are some standard-setting bodies where you have FRAND requirements, right? So you actually contractually commit as a result of the standard-setting process to have non-discrimination. Whether that would be a sufficient solution, I'm not so sure. I don't think that really would be to the question you asked. It seems to me if you want to have some non-discrimination provisions and have a justification for it, it sounds more regulatory to me than under the antitrust laws.
Just to be clear, we're misinterpreting Trinco. Trinco is a case that says we spent 10 years as a Congress, we've delegated our authority, we came up with the 1996 Telecommunications Act, which was an extensive, I mean, you know, these are the two reports, extensive laws in which we're going to regulate the telecommunications industry. And all it said was, once we've done that, you can't overlay now an antitrust solution to something we've already created a solution for. It wasn't meant to be, oh, there's no right to equal access. So I think probably the better analogy is Aspen Ski, but leaving that aside, I think we got to, you know, there's a disconnect between what lawyers think the laws say and what economists think the laws say.
I suspect that will be a recurring theme these 2 days. Okay, we're going to try and do a couple more questions.
Wait, I don't get a shot at any of this?
Oh, sorry. Forgive me. Jason, could you please confess your sins to the room?
Right. I mean, just on the other one, on Carl's question, first of all, I'd just ask you what the answer was, and then I'd believe that. I'm a little bit less excited about patrolling these boundaries between antitrust and regulation. I think it's all competition policy. It's all about how you facilitate, you know, more entry, more competition, and there's different tools that can help get you there, and where those sit within the law or the labels, I'm either too ignorant to be excited about or too economically minded to be excited about. On retrospectives, I thought I'd answer 2 questions you didn't ask and then not answer yours. I think retrospectives are a really important part of what we need to be doing for mergers, for competition. I think there's a lot we could learn from them. On Dennis's, you know, you can't predict the future. I think that's absolutely right. That just says then you need to decide what your presumption about the future is, because you're going to make errors in both directions, and how do you balance those errors? And the errors we've made have been exceedingly imbalanced. And in some of these cases, you know, you can run all the structural models you want, or you can go out and read Wired, and like they know what's going on. And so we should have some way to take that into account to a greater degree. In terms of the you know, Google case in particular, there was no one in my building that had anything to do with that case. I would say the first merger or two, big merger or two, when I was in the White House, AT&T, T-Mobile, they all called us. They all said what they thought. We all said we're not going to listen and not do anything. I'd say by year 4, almost every big company was sophisticated enough that they knew we weren't going to get involved, and they didn't even bring the topic up with us. So it wasn't something I studied or worked on while I was there. I haven't studied or worked on it enough since then to have a particularly strong opinion about, you know, about that case.
I'm sure that's exactly how the White House works right now. Okay, let's try and do a couple of other questions quickly. And again, please try and keep it brief so we can pack them in. Go ahead.
Yeah, I wanted to return to the notion that the GDPR might have had a chilling effect on innovation. From our perspective, the New York Times, I would say in my experience it's been the opposite. Here, it's very hard to innovate in the advertising space because there's no data regulation. So everything goes to Facebook and to Google, and we have to sell data to them in order to survive. Whereas in Europe, we have the opportunity to actually innovate things because the data market is much more competitive. So I was wondering if the panel had a view on specifically that chilling effect of regulation on innovation.
I'm going to go, I think this is probably going to be the last one. But
Do we wait on the answer to this one, or do I?
Go ahead, and we'll.
All right,
And I guess
so-
we can choose which one we want to answer.
So very quickly, the history of payment networks has traditionally been from starting with closed loop systems to open loop systems, right? And that doesn't seem to have dented their market power. Visa and MasterCard are open loop and way more open than Amex, for example, and they're very dominant.
Open loop?
Open loop systems means that you have two-sided markets and the payment network doesn't control everything, right? So openness doesn't seem to blunt payment networks' power. Why should we think that prying open big tech platforms with data portability, either narrow or broad, or well, there's the data portability, and then there's the open standards, I think that was mentioned, would blunt market power, given that we have data points that show that making a platform more open, either willfully or not so willfully, does not blunt power.
Okay, GDPR, does it chill innovation?
The relationship of GDPR to competition law and so on is something which we are not entirely sure about. Okay, so we really can't say whether the GDPR is going to chill innovation or improve it, because it hasn't been. It's beginning to be implemented, and we don't have time. But there are parts of the GDPR of which we don't really know what they mean, and that's going to be determined by the court. So, so there's lots of hope of people say, oh, because people are going to trust that their data is going to be used in normal way. This is going to give a competitive advantage to Europe. That sounds to me a little bit like wishful thinking. And I think we really have to wait and see. I mean, it's, but you know, I'm like a lawyer, you know.
Okay, and then just lastly on or sort of openness and data interoperability, does it really make any difference? Do you think the payments and credit card example works?
So I would answer this two ways. I think you're absolutely right. Visa and MasterCard are open standards. American Express and Discover are closed loops. They're, you know, Europe is trying to regulate all of them. But at the same time, and I do think that, you know, you have the Android system, which is supposedly an open standard for phones, but Google clearly has created its own closed environment for that. So it's not an open versus closed. I think that what happens, and it's actually the prime example of why other laws matter. And you can't just look at antitrust. Because antitrust can do certain things, but what it can't do, and this is starting to play out in Europe, you have this open banking standard, great, they can use the data from banks. I question whether that really complies with GDPR, but okay. But leaving that aside, what you are seeing now is that it still creates issues with anti-money laundering, fraud, all these other things that they didn't consider when they thought, oh, we'll just solve this one competitive problem. And that's why you can't just look at anything in isolation. You have to look at it in the panoply of laws that exist for a specific industry.
I would just quickly say, if I could just briefly answer both questions on regulation and GPDR, as Jacques said, you know, we'll see how it turns out. Regulation often harms entry because it imposes fixed costs on firms, and therefore the smallest firms can't survive. So just, you got to be careful. Obviously, it'll depend how it works out. In terms of the question about credit cards, if you look at New Zealand, Australia, Europe, they have had both regulatory and antitrust interventions. And you know, my reading of the evidence is it's helped their consumers. We, in the American Express case, did not. My view is we made a mistake and lost an opportunity to help American consumers.
Okay. This is really the last
yeah,
one.
no, and I agree with that. I mean, the answer to like, are you in favor of like uncareful regulation or careful? You know, it's always careful. And that's why something like, you know, we had the code of conduct applying to large companies so that small companies can enter. They can behave however they want, but once you become a bottleneck or gateway, you can't. And I think the idea that regulation can chill innovation, certainly true. It can also foster it. Monopolies can also chill innovation, and so we need to balance all of these.
Okay, so we've, I think, attempted to sort of straddle the transatlantic divide, not entirely successfully, but there does seem to be some common ground on this. I'm going to finish by asking each of you to answer in literally 2 words your sense of where this ends up. Are regulated tech firms, are they broken up? Are they free to do whatever they want? Does antitrust inhibit them but not kill them? What's the end game, Jason, your prediction?
Tougher merger enforcement and some regulation in some jurisdictions.
Okay.
I don't think you should think about the end game. We don't know what it's going to be. You should think of what you can do in the next 5 years, which is reasonable, and adapt afterwards.
Okay. Well.
So the discussion today kind of highlighted the conservative, let's regulate it before it can be bad approach versus the US, which is sort of open markets, and then if it becomes bad, let's restrict it. I think where we end up is where I think ultimately European and US law, competition law has always ended up. You reach a point of convergence on these issues.
Dennis?
My view is we can improve the process of competition through the antitrust laws. You've got to go quick in some of these markets before they tip, but there's no doubt that some regulation could perhaps improve the process of competition in a way that the antitrust laws are ill-suited to do right now.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. I think we're going straight to Tyler Kern and Tim.
Yeah,
Yeah.
we're going to go straight
Thank
to
you
the
very
debate,
much.
please. Thank you.